Hello, everyone, and welcome to Listen and Learn English. I'm Catherine, your host for today's episode and every episode of this podcast. I'm so happy you've joined me today. If you're new here, this podcast is designed to help you improve your English listening skills through natural, authentic conversations and stories from my life. I believe the best way to learn a language is through real-life scenarios and everyday experiences. Before I dive into today's stories, let me quickly explain how to get the most out of this podcast. First, just listen and try to understand as much as you can. Then try the shadowing technique. Listen again and repeat what I say right after you hear it. This helps with pronunciation and rhythm. Finally, repetition is key. Listen multiple times until you feel comfortable with all the vocabulary and expressions. Now, let's get started with today's episode. Last weekend, I had one of those experiences that reminds you how unpredictable life can be. I was driving home from visiting my sister in Connecticut. It's usually about a 3-hour drive. The weather forecast had mentioned a chance of rain, but nothing serious. About halfway through my journey, the sky suddenly turned this ominous dark gray color. Within minutes, I found myself in the middle of the most intense thunderstorm I've experienced in years. The rain was coming down so hard that I could barely see the road in front of me. Cars were pulling over to the side of the highway, hazard lights blinking. I decided to do the same, finding a safe spot under an overpass where several other drivers had already taken shelter. As we all sat there waiting for the storm to pass, something interesting happened. A man in the car next to mine rolled down his window and asked if I was okay. He introduced himself as Mike, a retired meteorologist who explained that this was a phenomenon called a microburst, an intense, localized downdraft of air that can cause extreme rain and wind in a small area. Soon, the drivers of 3 other cars joined our impromptu weather lesson, all of us strangers brought together by circumstance. For about 45 minutes, we stood there under the overpass, sharing stories and snacks. There was a family returning from a college tour with their daughter, a couple on their way to celebrate their anniversary, and a woman traveling with her dog. In any other situation, we would have driven right past each other, completely unaware of each other's existence. But the storm had created this unexpected moment of community. When the rain finally eased up enough for us to continue driving, we all exchanged waves and well wishes as if we were old friends. I continued my journey home, thinking about how these random connections are often the most memorable parts of our days. It wasn't the destination that made an impact on me that day, but this unplanned pause in the journey. Speaking of unexpected encounters, I had another interesting experience last month at my local coffee shop. I go there almost every morning before work. It's part of my routine. I'm one of those people who orders the exact same thing every day, a medium oat milk latte with an extra shot of espresso. The baristas know my order by heart at this point. But on this particular morning, there was a new barista. When I reached the front of the line and started to order, she stopped me and said, "Wait, let me guess. You look like a cappuccino person." I laughed and told her my usual order. She seemed disappointed that she'd guessed wrong. So I asked what had made her think I was a cappuccino person. She explained that she had this theory that you could tell a lot about someone's personality based on their coffee order. According to her theory, latte drinkers tend to be more easygoing and sociable, while cappuccino drinkers are more precise and detail-oriented. Americano drinkers are straightforward and no-nonsense. And people who order those fancy drinks with extra syrups and whipped cream are creative types who enjoy life's little pleasures. I was so intrigued by her coffee personality theory that I ended up sitting at the counter chatting with her during her break. Her name was Eliza, and it turned out she was a psychology student working on a thesis about consumer habits and personality traits. The coffee shop was actually part of her research. She was observing patterns in customer orders and behaviors. By the time I left the coffee shop that day, I was running late for work, but I had made a fascinating new connection. Since then, Eliza and I have become friends, and I've even participated in some of her research studies, all because I was curious about being labeled a cappuccino person. These kinds of random encounters have always fascinated me. They remind me that behind every face we pass on the street, there's a whole universe of experiences, knowledge, and stories. I think that's why I've always been drawn to jobs and hobbies that put me in contact with different people. Before I became a podcast host, I worked as a tour guide in my city for about 5 years, and let me tell you, that job was a masterclass in human nature. One tour stands out in my memory particularly clearly. It was a rainy Tuesday afternoon, and I was expecting a slow day. These weekday tours during off-season usually attracted only a handful of people. To my surprise, only one person showed up, an elderly gentleman named Harold who was visiting from Australia. My first instinct was to cancel the tour. It hardly seemed worth it for just one person. But Harold had come prepared with a raincoat, umbrella, and an enthusiasm that was impossible to resist. So we set off, just the two of us, for what should have been a standard 2-hour walking tour of the city's historical sites, but it quickly became anything but standard. Harold, I discovered, was a retired history professor with a particular interest in urban architecture. What was supposed to be a general overview turned into an in-depth discussion about building styles, historical preservation, and the evolution of city planning. At one point, we stopped for coffee to escape a heavy downpour, and Harold shared photos of his own city in Australia, pointing out similarities and differences in how our cities had developed. The scheduled 2-hour tour stretched into nearly 4 hours, and by the end, I felt like I had learned more than I had taught. Before we parted ways, Harold handed me a small notebook. "For your thoughts," he said. "I've carried one of these my whole life. You never know when you'll meet someone or see something worth remembering." I still have that notebook, now filled with observations and stories from encounters like the one with Harold himself. That experience changed how I approach my tours. I became less focused on delivering the same scripted information each time and more interested in creating a unique experience based on who was in my group. Some of my best reviews came after I abandoned the standard route to follow the interests of my tourists, whether that meant exploring hidden street art alleys with a group of art students or hunting down the best local food spots with culinary enthusiasts. This mindset of being open to detours has served me well beyond my tour guide days. Last summer, I was planning a solo hiking trip in the Adirondack Mountains. I had my route all mapped out, a popular trail that would take me past several scenic viewpoints. The night before my hike, I stayed at a small bed and breakfast where I met a couple at breakfast who were local to the area. When I mentioned my planned route, they exchanged a knowing look. "That trail is beautiful," the woman said, "but everyone does that one. If you want something truly special..." Her husband pulled out a map and showed me an alternative route, one that wasn't in any of the guidebooks. It would take me past a hidden waterfall and through a valley that was carpeted with wildflowers this time of year. I had a moment of hesitation. I had researched my original route thoroughly and felt confident about it. This new path was an unknown, but something about their enthusiasm convinced me, and I decided to trust these strangers' advice. That hike turned out to be one of the most magical experiences of my life. The waterfall was indeed hidden and spectacular, with no other hikers around. The valley was exactly as they had described, filled with wildflowers in every color imaginable. At the highest point of the trail, I found a natural rock formation that created a perfect seat overlooking the entire valley. I sat there for nearly an hour, eating my lunch and taking in the view that I never would have discovered if I hadn't been willing to change my plans. When I returned to the bed and breakfast 2 days later, I brought the couple a thank you gift, a framed photo I had taken of the waterfall. They seemed genuinely touched and invited me to join them for dinner, where they shared more local secrets and stories about the area's history. We've kept in touch ever since, and I've returned to visit them twice. What began as a casual breakfast conversation turned into a genuine friendship. These experiences have taught me that some of life's richest moments come from being open to the unexpected. This philosophy was put to the ultimate test 3 years ago when I lost my job during company-wide layoffs. I had been working as a marketing director for a tech company for 7 years. It was a stable job with good benefits and a clear career path. Suddenly, I found myself unemployed for the first time in my adult life. The first few weeks were tough. I updated my resume, applied for similar positions, and went through the motions of job hunting. But my heart wasn't in it. The truth was, I had been feeling creatively stifled in that role for years, staying mostly for the security it provided. Now that the security was gone, I had an opportunity to reassess what I really wanted. During this period of unemployment, I started volunteering at a community radio station, mostly to keep myself busy and to network. They needed someone to help with their social media presence, which aligned with my marketing background. But what started as a way to fill time quickly became the highlight of my week. I loved the creative energy of the station, the diverse range of people who came through its doors, and the way stories were shared through audio. One day, the station manager asked if I would be interested in hosting a small segment, a 15-minute weekly feature interviewing local business owners. My first instinct was to say no. I had no broadcasting experience, and the thought of my voice being on the radio was terrifying. But remembering my philosophy about embracing the unexpected, I agreed to give it a try. That first interview was a disaster. I spoke too quickly, interrupted my guest, and completely lost my train of thought halfway through. I was sure they would never ask me back, but the station manager saw potential where I only saw failure. Radio is a skill like any other, she told me. No one is good their first time. The question is whether you enjoyed it enough to get better. And the truth was, despite my nervousness and mistakes, I had enjoyed it immensely. There was something about connecting with someone through conversation, about creating a space where they felt comfortable sharing their story that resonated deeply with me. So I practiced. I recorded myself reading news articles to work on my pacing. I studied interviews by hosts I admired. I volunteered to cover more segments, gaining experience with each one. 6 months later, when a paid position opened up at the station, I applied and got the job. It paid significantly less than my previous corporate role, but the fulfillment it provided was worth far more than the difference in salary. 2 years after that, I pitched the idea for this podcast, combining my newfound love of audio storytelling with my interest in connecting people across cultures. Looking back, losing my job, which felt like a disaster at the time, was actually the push I needed to find work that truly energized me. Had I immediately found another marketing position, I might never have discovered this path that has brought me so much joy and purpose. This pattern of unexpected detours leading to meaningful destinations has appeared so often in my life that I've come to trust it. Like the time I got on the wrong train in Chicago and ended up in a neighborhood I'd never visited before. Rather than immediately turning around, I decided to explore for a while and discovered a small bookstore that specialized in travel literature. The owner recommended a book that inspired my trip to New Zealand the following year, a journey that changed my perspective on environmental conservation and led to me volunteering with a wildlife protection organization, or the time I reluctantly attended a friend's dinner party where I knew no one else, only to meet a woman who had just returned from volunteering at a school in Guatemala. Her stories about the experience were so compelling that 6 months later, I found myself teaching English at that same school for a summer, an experience that improved my Spanish and gave me a deep appreciation for the challenges faced by educators in under-resourced communities. I've come to believe that these wrong turns are often the universe's way of putting us exactly where we need to be. That's not to say we should abandon all plans and structure. There's certainly value in setting goals and working toward them. But within that framework, leaving room for serendipity has enriched my life in ways I could never have planned. One of my favorite examples of embracing the unexpected happened during a solo trip to Portugal a few years ago. I had booked a food tour in Lisbon that I was really looking forward to. A chance to sample local specialties with the guidance of someone who knew the city well. But when I arrived at the meeting point, the guide explained that there had been a booking error. The tour was actually full, and my reservation hadn't been properly recorded. I was disappointed, of course, and a bit annoyed at the mix-up. As I stood there trying to decide what to do with my suddenly free afternoon, an elderly Portuguese woman who had overheard the conversation approached me. In broken English mixed with gestures, she offered to show me her favorite food spots in the neighborhood. Her name was Mariana, and she had lived in that same Alfama district of Lisbon for over 70 years. My initial hesitation about following a stranger quickly gave way to curiosity. Mariana took me to places no tourist tour would ever include. A tiny bakery tucked away in an alley where they made pastries using a recipe unchanged for generations. Her friend's living room, which doubled as an informal restaurant serving home-cooked seafood stew to neighbors. A corner store where the owner made his own cheese. Between these food stops, Mariana showed me the building where she was born, the church where she got married, and the small plaza where she still meets her friends every Sunday after Mass. She pointed out details I would never have noticed on my own. A centuries-old tile pattern unique to her street, a small shrine built into a wall, the best spot to stand to hear the fadistas singing in a nearby bar. By the end of the afternoon, I had experienced a version of Lisbon that no official tour could have provided. The city as seen through the eyes of someone who had loved it her whole life. When I tried to pay her for her time, Mariana refused. Instead, she asked me to send her a postcard from my home city, which I did. We exchanged addresses, and for several years afterward, we maintained a correspondence. Her letters in Portuguese with the help of her granddaughter, mine in simple English that her granddaughter would translate for her. Mariana passed away last year, and her granddaughter wrote to let me know. She said her grandmother had often spoken about the afternoon she spent showing The American Girl around her neighborhood. What had been a chance encounter for me had also been a memorable day for Mariana, a reminder that these connections we form go both ways. This is something I think about often. We tend to focus on how our own lives are affected by the people we meet, but we're simultaneously playing a role in their stories. The barista who shared her coffee personality theory with me, the couple who redirected my hike, Harold with his notebook, I entered their lives as randomly as they entered mine. I've been trying to be more conscious of this lately, the idea that I might be a meaningful part of someone else's day or even life story without realizing it. It makes me more intentional about my interactions, more present in conversations, more willing to offer help or connection when the opportunity arises. I remembered my own first solo flight and how overwhelming it had felt. I showed her how to check the status of her connection on the airline app and explained the process for getting assistance if she did miss it. We ended up talking for the entire 2-hour delay, and I learned she was flying to begin her freshman year of college, the same college my niece attends. I was able to give her tips about the campus and city, and by the time we boarded, she seemed much more at ease. As we were saying goodbye, she thanked me and said, "I was so nervous about this trip, but meeting you made me feel like maybe this was all meant to happen this way." Her comment stuck with me because it so perfectly captured my own philosophy about unexpected encounters. I don't know if I'll ever see that young woman again, but for those 2 hours in the airport, our life paths crossed in a meaningful way. And that's really what I've come to value most, these temporary but genuine connections that remind us of our shared humanity. So that's what I try to bring to this podcast each week, stories about real moments and real connections that have shaped my understanding of the world. Some are dramatic, others quiet and subtle, but each has taught me something about what it means to be human in this complex, interconnected world we share. Thank you so much for listening to today's episode of Listen and Learn English. I hope these stories resonated with you in some way. Remember to practice shadowing with this episode and listen multiple times to catch details you might have missed. Until next time, this is Catherine signing off, and I'll talk to you again soon.